Okay, so crossing now into more of the anatomy that you'll look at your labs instead of the more physiology that we typically look at in our lectures. And this short lecture is going to cover our joints. So only 5 learning objectives to go over, and they are simply to define the term joint, to take a look at how we classify the various joints, and then to describe the structure and the function of the 3 different types of joints when we classify them structurally. So getting straight into learning objective number 1, and that was to define the term joint. So a joint is a point of contact between 2 bones, between bone and cartilage, or between bone and teeth. A joint can also be called an articulation or an arthrosis. So an example of a joint between 2 bones is our elbow joint. So you can see that here. We have the trochlea of the humerus articulating with the trochlear notch of our ulna. An example of a joint between bone and cartilage is our sternocostal joints. So between the costal cartilages of ribs 5 to 7 and our sternum. And an example of a joint between bone and teeth is what we call a gymphosis. So this is the name for where the pegs of our teeth fit into the sockets of our maxilla or our mandible. So now we know what a joint is and what it can be. We need to now describe the structural and the functional classification of these joints, just to separate them up a bit. So joints can be classified structurally, which is based on their anatomical characteristics or what they look like, or functionally, which is based on the type of movement that they permit. The structural classification of joints is based on 2 different criteria. Firstly, the presence or the absence of a space between the articulating bones, and this is what we call a synovial cavity. And then secondly, the type of connective tissue that binds these bones together. In this joint here, which is our proximal interphalangeal joint, so the joint between your phalanges in the middle of your finger, this part in yellow here is our synovial cavity, so that's space between our 2 articulating bones. The connective tissue holding the joint together is this fibrous membrane on the outside here. Using this structural classification, joints are classified as one of 3 of the following types. Either a fibrous joint, in which there is no synovial cavity and the bones are held together by dense irregular connective tissue. A cartilaginous joint, where there is also no synovial cavity, but the bones are held together by cartilage. Or a synovial joint, where there is a synovial cavity, and the bones are held together again by that dense irregular connective tissue, which is made up to form an articular capsule. So the names of these different classifications do give you a little bit of an idea about these joints, but we are going to talk about each of these different types in a little bit more detail in the learning objectives to come. Looking at the functional classification of joints, and this, remember, relates to the degree of movement that they permit. And functionally, our joints are classified again into one of 3 ways. We have a synarthrosis, which is an immovable joint, so it does not allow any movement. We have an amphiarthrosis, which is a slightly movable joint. And we have a diarthrosis, so this is a freely movable joint. If again we look at this proximal interphalangeal joint here, this is a diarthrosis joint or a freely movable joint. And in fact, all of our diarthroses are also synovial joints. And so because of the various shapes of the articulating bones, combined with the fact that they have this little bit of space in between those 2 bones, they do permit several types of movements. So typically when we're looking at our joints, we do look at them based on how they're classified structurally. So learning objective 3 is now coming back to this classification of joints and looking at the structure and the function of each of those different types, starting first up with our fibrous joints. So as we previously noted, a fibrous joint lacks a synovial cavity. The articulating bones are then held together really tightly by dense irregular connective tissue. Fibrosis joints permit little to no movement, so they can also be classified functionally as amphiarthroses or synarthroses joints. Now, there are 3 different types of fibrous joints. These are sutures, Syndesmoses, or interosseous membranes. So starting up with our sutures, and a suture is a fibrous joint composed of thin, dense, irregular connective tissue. Within the human body, the only place that we can find a suture is between the bones of the skull. So you remember our skull looks like this. Each plate is a different bone of the skull, and the bones are held together by these sutures. The irregular interlocking edges, so kind of like a jigsaw, they fit in together, of these sutures is what gives them extra strength, and it also decreases their chance of fracturing. So always good when we're talking about the skull and the brain that it protects underneath. In older individuals, the sutures are completely immovable, so are our synarthroses, but in infants and in children, they are slightly movable, or our amphiarthroses. So obviously as their brains and their heads grow, it allows that little bit of space. We then have our syndesmoses, and so this is a fibrous joint in which there is a bigger distance between the articulating bones, and there's more dense irregular connective tissue surrounding the joint than what we find in a suture. So the connective tissue is typically arranged as a bundle in the form of a ligament, and the ligaments are what actually limit the movement at that joint. So an example of a syndesmosis is the distal tibiofibular joint. So it's where the anterior tibiofibular ligament connects our tibia to the fibula, and it permits slight movement at the ankle. So it's also classified as that amphiarthroses. Another example is our gymphosis. So we've talked about this one already, which was the joint between the tooth and the respective jawbone. And in healthy teeth, this joint permits no movement. The final category of our fibrous joint is the interosseous membrane. And so this is where you have a substantial or a large sheet of dense irregular connective tissue that binds neighbouring long bones, so 2 bones that lie next to each other. It will permit slight movement and is therefore classified as an amphiarthrosis joint. There are 2 main interosseous membrane joints in the human body. One occurs in the forearm between our radius and our ulna, and the other occurs between the tibia and the fibula of our lower leg. So moving on to our next type of structural joint, and that is our cartilaginous joint. So like a fibrous joint, a cartilaginous joint also lacks this synovial cavity. There's no space between those articulating bones, and it allows little to no movement. Here, our articulating bones are tightly connected by either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. The 2 types of cartilaginous joints that we have are our Synchondroses or our Symphyses. So our Synchondroses are a cartilaginous joint in which the connecting material is hyaline cartilage. So the cartilage that holds the 2 pieces of bone or the 2 articulating bones together is hyaline cartilage. The most prominent example of a synchondrosis is the epiphyseal plate that connects the epiphysis and the diaphysis of our growing bones. Functionally, a synchondrosis is an immovable joint, so also described as a synarthroses. And another example of this type of joint is between the first rib and the manubrium of the sternum. Both of these examples actually ossify or become bone as we become adults. So this joint is only found in children that have not stopped growing. Our symphyses or our symphyses are cartilaginous joints in which the ends of the articular articulating bones are covered in hyaline cartilage, but it's actually a disc of fibrocartilage which holds those bones together. And interestingly, all symphyses actually occur in the midline of the body. So for example, we have our pubic symphysis here. So the two anterior parts of the pelvis are covered in hyaline cartilage, but it's this disc of fibrocartilage that actually holds those two bones together. The other example is our intervertebral joints, which is where the bodies of the vertebra are connected by our intervertebral discs, which of course are made up of fibrocartilage. A symphysis is a slightly movable or an amphiarthrosis joint. And lastly, we come to our synovial joints. So a classification in which there are quite a few different types and they can be a little more complicated. So in this learning objective, we're not only going to tell you about the different types of synovial joints they are, but also some other structures which you might find within a synovial joint. So the unique characteristic of this type of joint is the presence of a synovial cavity. You may also see that written as a joint cavity between those two articulating bones. Like a symphysis, the articulating bones of a synovial joint are covered by a layer of hyaline cartilage, and we specifically call this articular cartilage. The cartilage covers the articulating surfaces of the bones with a smooth, really slippery surface, but it's not actually what binds them together. Articular cartilage reduces the friction between the bones when they move, and also help to a small degree to absorb shock. All of our synovial joints are diarthroses joints, so our freely movable joints, and there are 6 subcategories of synovial joint, but we're actually going to touch on this a little later. First, we're going to look at the different accessory structures that you may find within a synovial joint. So these are our articular capsule, synovial membrane, ligaments, articular discs, labra, bursa, and tendon sheath. So if we take a look at, again, the joint in the middle of our finger, our proximal interphalangeal joint, this here is our articular or our joint capsule. So our articular or our joint capsule surrounds our synovial joints a little bit like a sleeve, uniting the two articulating bones. The articular capsule is made up of 2 different layers, an outer fibrous membrane, so that's this white part here, and then an inner synovial membrane. So you can see that highlighted in the red and the blue there. The fibrous membrane consists of dense irregular connective tissue that attaches to the periosteum, or that outer layer of the articulating bones. And this fibrous membrane is flexible yet strong. So with the flexibility, it permits considerable movement at the joint, but its tensile strength, so its ability to resist force, is what helps it prevent dislocation. The fibres of some of the fibrous membrane can actually be arranged in parallel bundles of dense regular connective tissue that are highly adapted for resisting strains in particular directions. So these bundles of dense regular connective tissue are what we know as ligaments. The inner synovial membrane, or the inner layer of the synovial capsule, is composed of areolar connective tissue, and it has a large number of elastic fibres. The synovial membrane secretes synovial fluid into this joint here, which is quite a viscous or a thick, clear or pale yellow fluid, which looks in both its appearance and consistency somewhat like an uncooked egg white. Synovial fluid consists of hyaluronic acid secreted by synovial cells, as well as interstitial fluid, which is filtered out of our blood plasma. The synovial fluid will form a really thin film over the surfaces within that articular capsule and function to reduce friction, to help absorb shock, and to supply oxygen and nutrients to, and remove carbon dioxide and waste from, the chondrocytes within the articular cartilage. Because remember, our cartilage is often avascular. Synovial fluid within the synovial cavity will also contain phagocytic cells. So these will help remove microbes or any debris that results from normal wear and tear within a joint. Of course, to a degree. Many synovial joints will also contain what we call accessory ligaments that are either extracapsular ligaments or intracapsular ligaments. So as their name suggests, extracapsular ligaments lie outside of the articular capsule, while intracapsular ligaments lie within or inside the articular capsule. The intracapsular ligaments that lie within the articular capsule are not actually part of the synovial cavity because they're excluded from this by the synovial membrane. Now, examples of these extracapsular ligaments are our fibula and our tibial collateral ligaments that sit either side of our knee joint. Examples of our intracapsular ligaments are our anterior cruciate and our posterior cruciate ligaments here. Within the knee, we also find another accessory structure which is present in some, but not all, synovial joints, and this is our meniscus. These meniscus can also be called articular discs. And it's made up of a pad of fibrocartilage which lies between the two articulating surfaces of the bones. So the meniscus or the articular disc will bind really strongly to the inside of the fibrous membrane. And although we're not fully sure of all of the functions of this piece of fibrocartilage, it is believed to help assist in shock absorption, so the pressure coming down here from the femur, to create a better fit between the two articulating bones, provide an adaptable or slightly movable surface for different functions or joint movements at the knee, to help improve weight distribution over those two pieces of bone, and also to help distribute that synovial fluid across the articular surfaces of the joint. Lastly, on this side of the slide, we have our labra, or our labrum as a singular. And a labrum is also a piece of fibrocartilage that actually extends from the edge of a joint socket. So it's quite common in our ball and socket joints, such as those of the shoulder and those of the hip. So as you can see here, the labrum helps deepen the joint socket to increase the area of contact between the socket and the ball of the head of the femur, and helps slightly prevent that dislocation. The last accessory structures that we'll take a look at today are our bursa and our tendon sheaths. So as our joints move and the bones articulate or move over one another, so do some of the ligaments, the tendons, and the muscles within the region. And anytime two surfaces rub over one another, they can create friction. Within some of our synovial joints, however, we have sac-like structures called bursa, which are strategically located to reduce this friction. So one example of a bursa is this suprapatellar bursa here. So you can see it's where we've got bone, and we've got the tendon of that quadricep muscle. So that bursa sits in here to stop the friction between these two structures. Bursa are filled with a small amount of fluid that's quite similar to our synovial fluid and can be located between the skin and bones, between tendons and bones, between muscles and bones, or between ligaments and bones. The fluid-filled sacs help cushion the movement of these body parts up against one another and help reduce that friction. Structures called tendon sheaths are also found to reduce friction at joints. Tendon sheaths, sometimes also called synovial sheaths, are basically like tube-shaped bursa. So they wrap around certain tendons that experience considerable friction as they pass through tunnels formed by connective tissue and bone. The inner layer of a tendon sheath, which is what we call the visceral layer, is attached to the surface of the tendon, so it's actually attached to the tendon itself. The outer layer, which we call the parietal layer, is attached to the bone. Between these two layers is a cavity that contains that synovial fluid. Tendon sheaths are typically found where a tendon will pass through a synovial cavity, such as the tendon of the biceps brachii at the shoulder joint, as well as those at the wrist, the ankle, and the fingers and toes. So we take a look at this yellow part here and this yellow part here, and it's just reducing that friction of the tendon rubbing up against the bone as we move that shoulder joint. So now moving on to the different types of our synovial joints, and although all synovial joints have many characteristics in common, the shapes of the articulating surfaces all vary, and thus the types of movements permitted by the joints will vary significantly. Within the classification of a synovial joint, we have different subtypes that are based basically on the movement that they permit. These subtypes are our plane joints, our hinge joints, our pivot joints, our condyloid joints, saddle joints, and ball and socket joints. So starting with our plane joints, and the articulating surfaces of the bones in this type of joint are either flat or slightly curved. Plane joints permit back and forth movement or side to side movement, although sometimes they can actually rotate up against one another. Some examples of plane joints are the intertarsal joints between the tarsal bones of the ankle, and the intercarpal joints between the carpal bones of the wrists. So you've got these flat or slightly curved surfaces rubbing up against each other, either side to side, back and forward, or in some occasions, rotating around. In a hinge joint, the convex, so our convex is this part that bulges out here, surface of one bone fits into the concave or the depressed surface of another bone. And as the name implies, a hinge joint produces an angular opening and closing motion, much like that of a hinged door. In most of our hinge joint movements, one bone will remain fixed while the other bone moves around the axis. Hinge joints only permit flexion and extension, so they move across one axis. And we have examples at the elbow, so we've got our humerus and our ulna here. We also have similar joints in our ankles and our interphalangeal joints, which are the joints between the phalanges of our fingers and our toes. In a pivot joint, the rounded or the pointed surface of one bone articulates with a ring formed partly by another bone and partly by a ligament. A pivot joint, again, as the name suggests, allows rotation around its own longitudinal or lengthways axis. Examples of pivot joints include the atlantoaxial joint of the vertebral column, so where your atlas will rotate around the axis, which is what allows your head to turn side to side as if you're saying no, as well as your radio-ulnar joint, which is what allows your palm to turn anteriorly and posteriorly as the head of the radius pivots around its long axis and into that radial notch of the ulna there. In a condyloid joint, the convex oval-shaped projection of one bone will fit into the oval-shaped depression of another bone. So we've got our projection here fitting into that rounded depression here. And a condyloid joint permits movement around two different axes. So for example, flexion and extension one way, and then abduction and adduction around the other. Combining these movements, we can also have some very limited circumduction, which is kind of like combining all of those joints and moving in a bit of a circle. Some examples of our condyloid joints are the radiocarpal or our wrist joints, so here, got the concave and the convex surfaces there, and a metacarpophalangeal joints between the metacarpals and the proximal phalange joints, which would be down here. In a saddle joint, the articular surface of one bone is saddle-shaped. So imagine this bottom part here that's kind of dug out like a saddle, and the articular surface of the other bone fits into the saddle, kind of like a rider on a horse. The movement permitted at this joint is flexion and extension, so say flexion and extension this way, as well as abduction and adduction this way, and of course combining those movements we have that limited circumduction. An example of a saddle joint is our carpometacarpal joint, which is between the trapezium, so this is a carpal bone here, right at the base of the thumb, and then the metacarpal of our thumb. So we've got the saddle and then the horse rider fitting in that surface there. And lastly, we have our ball and socket joints, which is somewhat self-explanatory. They consist of our ball-like surface of one bone fitting into a cup-like socket of another bone. These types of joints permit movement around 3 different axes. So we have, say, flexion and extension, abduction and adduction, and then rotation. Some examples of a ball and socket joints are the shoulder joint, and then our hip joint, which is what we have here. And then that is our lecture on joints. So next time you're in the lab, make sure that you have a look at some of our models or the cadavers and see if you can see some of these joints in real life. Thank you.